Why do the best manga have the worst endings? Jujutsu Kaisen just ended, and although it had some redeeming factors, everyone agrees this ending was a lot less than they were hoping for. Which for any other series would be just fine, but Jujutsu Kaisen has been one of the most talked about manga for the last 5 years. So to say its big finale was, just another fight is kind of depressing. And considering this seems to happen to every big manga like Naruto or Bleach, I'd like to take a moment to examine the history of shonen manga endings, analyze what went wrong with Jujutsu Kaisen and My Hero Academia, and explain why even a manga like Fire Force can have a much better ending than Jujutsu Kaisen. Now obviously this problem isn't an isolated incident. My Hero Academia just ended a month or two ago, and unfortunately, it had a lot of similar complaints. People saying fights were rushed, people saying Horikoshi ruined characters, people saying the final chapters were trash. Granted, people started bailing on My Hero Academia way before they started bailing on Jujutsu Kaisen. But it's kind of funny because the two ended within months of each other, and My Hero was getting trashed on, but as soon as they announced that JJK only had 5 chapters left, I swear, Twitter went from, "Oh, not my mangaka, oh, JJK is god tier," straight to JJK is doomed, Gege fell off. Which in my opinion reveals part of the problem of why these endings get the reactions that they do, but we'll get to why I think that is in just a minute. Now, in 2024, in a market where you have so many good manga, you might see My Hero get the reception it got and watch Jujutsu Kaisen fans either pray for JJK2 or burn their volumes, and you might get tempted to assume these manga were never that good in the first place. Which is completely untrue because My Hero has some of the most iconic characters in manga, and Jujutsu Kaisen has some of the best fights of all time. So then you might say, well, if these manga are so good, then how come they don't know how to write endings like in, say, Bleach or Naruto? But take a look at what happened to those manga and you realize it's the same story. In this day and age, it's become a new trend to look back on those manga and talk about how great their final arcs were, especially with the recent Bleach hype. But let's not kid ourselves. When these manga were ending, they were getting absolutely trashed on. And not just by haters, it was their own fans. And in a bizarre twist of irony, Bleach seems to have had all of the same complaints as Jujutsu Kaisen, and the same is true for Naruto and My Hero. If you compare them side by side, it's actually kinda crazy. Take Bleach and Jujutsu Kaisen. When Bleach ended, people said it was rushed, the fights were rushed, and they said Kubo forgot about characters. Sounds an awful lot similar to the JJK discourse lately. And it's a similar story with MHA and Naruto. With Naruto, people complained that nobody really died, that Kishimoto ruined the big villain, and that it felt rushed. Again, very similar to what people said about My Hero. And because this seems almost cyclical, one has to wonder if manga is really getting worse, or if there's a reason these big manga all have the same problem. But what a lot of people seem to forget is that these big manga have special issues that affect their endings. But before I explain what those are, make sure to like the video if you're enjoying it so far. It's the easiest way to support the channel, and it helps spread the video to other viewers like you. Now, with shonen manga, especially the big ones in, say, Shonen Magazine, or especially in Shonen Jump, if they get popular enough, then there's a solid chance they're gonna be at least 300 chapters long. Which doesn't sound that crazy when Bleach and Naruto are both about 700 chapters, but at 8 to 10 chapters a volume, that's like 30 plus volumes. That's a long-ass story. So for these kinds of manga, there's certain factors that ultimately affect the quality of the ending. One factor you have to consider is longevity. In other words, something these manga have to consider that other manga don't necessarily need to think about is where the story will be 2 to 5 years from now. Which sounds insane, but just think about it. You can't just have the premise in mind for a story. You gotta know what the first part is, what'll happen after that, and what kind of endgame this story will have. As an example outside of manga, I actually saw Richard Horvitz talking about Has-Been Hotel. Only the most popular show of the last year. Anyway, he was saying that when they pitch shows to streaming sites like Hulu or Netflix, those companies don't just want to hear your pitch for the first season. They want to know about season 2, 3, and even 4 and 5. Granted, he said in that case it's because the studio wants to know that the series will have some kind of end so it doesn't go on for too long, but it touches on this idea that when you're starting this super popular series, you gotta think beyond the first part. For example, look at Chainsaw Man. Chainsaw Man had an insanely popular run in Part 1, and I think we can all agree that the ending to Part 1 is perfect. Literally 0 complaints. But that was only 97 chapters. Tons of manga go beyond 97 chapters. Like, if you're gonna compare Jujutsu Kaisen to Chainsaw Man Part 1, you have to factor in the fact that Jujutsu Kaisen is much longer. Plus, you still have Part 2, so it's not like it's the end. And speaking of Part 2, when we're talking about this longevity thing, Part 2 isn't exactly keeping up to the hype of Part 1. The Part 1 run was unreal, and Part 2 started off really strong. But not considering the recent comeback, Part 2 has been kind of touch and go, and for the most part it's kind of failed to retain a lot of the fans that were on board for the weekly experience back in Part 1. And I think part of the problem is because you have the same story running for like 200 chapters. After a certain point, you kind of run out of steam before you either need to take a break or do something different. A perfect example of this is, of course, JoJo. Granted, JoJo is one long continuing story, but each part follows a new main character, each part aims to utilize a new genre, and especially in the earlier parts, each new part adds something new, like say stands. It's no coincidence that a manga that's split up into parts like this has managed to remain Shonen Jump's longest ongoing manga. It's because Araki takes the time to plan out each part as well as the following parts. Now, on top of that, the other issue that often comes up is the issue of pressure from the magazine. For example, if I'm not mistaken, Oda did not plan One Piece to be this long and specifically intended for the story to end with Luffy beating all of the warlords. But obviously, the people at Shueisha stepped in and were like, haha, no. And ever since then, Oda has had to add to the story and continue to flesh it out. So something these authors have to be aware of is, on top of knowing what the lifetime of the story is, they also have to be ready for when editors or publishers step in and ask them to keep things going for longer than they had planned. A big example of this is, unfortunately, Tokyo Revengers. I have not finished the manga myself, but I can say from experience that fandom turned on the manga so fast it was crazy. They went from hyping it up every week to never talking about it at all. And from what I could gather, a big complaint from fans was that it became clear the story had already gotten its proper ending, but because the story was so popular, the author Ken Wakoi had been asked to write one more arc, resulting in a final arc that fans felt was redundant and, in their words, just plain corny. Hence where we get into these manga endings that fans hate even though they love the manga right before it. And here's how these issues of longevity in the magazine tend to manifest themselves in these manga endings. The two big problems that seem to ruin every manga seem to be A, planning or lack thereof, and B, the expectations of the fans. Now, planning ties into everything we already kinda talked about. The more concrete the author's plans are for the story, the more prepared they are to end the manga and not deliver a final arc that feels rushed or feels like it came out of nowhere. The more you plan the story out, the more you know what to put, when to put it, and most importantly, how to actually do it. And that last part ties into the expectations thing. Because, see, you can plan the whole story out on paper, but when the time comes to actually write it out, how that's actually received is kinda up to fans. There's a ton of reasons for where they get them, but part of the problem of fans hating manga endings is either they expected something pretty simple and it just didn't happen, or they expected something that may or may not have ever had a chance of happening, and then they get all upset because their headcanon didn't turn out to be true. The biggest example of this in recent years is the ending of Attack on Titan. Now, for the most part, people liked the ending, but I was following that manga monthly, and dude, that was probably the most divisive manga ending I've ever seen. For every one thing that went right, it was like 2 things that people hated. On top of all of that, the thing I think people hated the most was what happened to Eren. Eren was this edgy Avenger the whole story, and then you get to the ending and he is the biggest wuss, we'll say, in the whole story. And when I say this is divisive, it's because it depends on what your expectations were for Eren. If you wanted him to be this super edgy character, then obviously you would think this ending is trash. But if you had a different opinion and thought maybe he was still the same kid from before, or he was always this way, then you probably liked the ending a lot more. The moral is how you enjoyed this ending largely depended on what your expectations were going into that finale. So in a lot of ways, fan expectations can ruin an ending. Because especially with all these agendas and theories, when these don't turn out the way people had it all in their heads, people hate what the story turned out to be. But of course, sometimes it's not the fan's fault. Sometimes it's the writer. And like we've been saying, that all comes down to how well they plan the story. For example, one of my all-time favorite manga is Soul Eater, and that first saga is insanely good. But from that point on, you can tell that Okubo hadn't really planned the story as much, and by that final arc, it becomes pretty clear that he was mostly tying up loose ends and hadn't planned most of the ending, even though it was a good ending. Contrast to when he does Fire Force, and it's like night and day. Now I know I've spoiled a lot of manga endings in this video, but I'm going to avoid spoilers for Fire Force only because it really is one of the best written manga endings of all time. Without saying too much, not only does he exceed the fan expectations, but he also recontextualizes all of Fire Force as well as all of Soul Eater. And of course, on top of that, he delivers insanely good fights that are some of the best in the whole series. As you can see, good planning can make a huge difference. Two stories, same writer, but one was sort of planned and the other might as well have been outlined by God himself. Now, I had to talk about Fire Force just because I love it so much and it doesn't get enough love. But for my fellow Fire Force fans out there who think it has the best final arc, I'd also like to throw Gintama into the ring. Gintama is actually a great example because if we're being honest, that's clearly a comedy manga, a gag manga. It obviously has tons of fights, but it's a gag manga that I don't think Sorachi ever planned to write for as long as he did. But because it was so popular in Japan, Shueisha kept asking him to continue the story. So in a way, I almost want to give more credit to Gintama because whereas Okubo knew exactly how long he wanted Fire Force to be, Sorachi was kind of making things up as he went along and still managed to deliver one of the most consistent manga in Jump with one of the best final arcs. So it's not like you have to have the entire story planned out, but because of things we talked about before, like magazine pressure, you still need to be able to add new material. So when it comes to the final arcs of these big manga, it comes down to these two factors of planning and expectations. And funny enough, when we look at My Hero and Jujutsu Kaisen, I think it's pretty clear how they each represent one end of the spectrum. On the one hand, I think My Hero represents where a manga ending falls flat of expectations. Because I think Horikoshi planned that ending exactly how he wanted to. I really don't think there's anything he could have fixed beyond adding a few more chapters for the epilogue. I think the only problem is that fans just don't like the ending all that much. For example, the final fight with Shigaraki and All for One is not what people wanted. And that's not like AOT where fans ruined it with their headcanon. Those final fights just aren't that exciting. The Shigaraki stuff is in character and fits with the themes of the story, but Shigaraki used to be one of the coolest, greatest villains in all of Jump, and by the end of My Hero he becomes one of the saddest villains thanks to how he gets taken over by AFO. And even worse, the stuff with All for One isn't even that good because it's your typical everyone rooting for Deku and Deku beating All for One in the same lame-ass way. Not like we saw him beat Overhaul or how he beat Gentle. And then there's the matter of what happens to Deku in the very end. That part is a bit more divisive, but even then, there's a lot of stuff that just feels disappointing. Like the fact that Deku and Ochako were clearly set up to be a couple throughout the entire story, and then we just don't see that. There's also the fact that Horikoshi baits you with the whole greatest hero thing, and then it's like, plot twist, we're all the greatest hero, haha, yay! Headcanon certainly influenced the reception of the final arc, but at the end of the day, a lot of this stuff is either boring or just plain bad. It has nothing to do with poor planning. It's really just not so great writing. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, I think it's pretty clear that Jujutsu Kaisen represents bad planning. Because the stuff that was clearly planned out is amazing. Like, Gojo vs. Sukuna? Amazing. Ouji taking Sukuna into his domain and explaining why he's trying to give Sukuna a second chance? Pure gold. But then there's so much other stuff that was clearly either forgotten about or just not planned out. First of all is the merger. Gewgle put all this time into hyping up Kenjaku and hyping up the merger, only for Kenjaku to get off-screened and all of that merger stuff to quietly fade into the void. Then there's the Hikari and Urame fight. Like, dude, seriously? Urame is in the background as a plot device for hundreds of chapters, and then when she has the time to do something to flesh out her character, she's ultimately reduced to the plot device she's always been. And Hikari, one of the strongest characters, basically has no involvement in the fight against Sukuna besides babysitting. And there's so much more that I don't even have time to pick apart. But, just to name a few, Nobara returning 5 chapters before the very end, Yuji's connection to Kenjaku never really getting explained, Yuji's ability to warp people's memories never getting a full explanation. Now granted, I'm recording this before the very last chapter, so who knows, I could be hasty, and this could all get answered in JJK2 like people are hoping for. But even then, it's like, if you're gonna start a sequel, can you at least do the first part right? Now, don't get me wrong, I still give My Hero a 7 out of 10, and while it's still early, I'd give Jujutsu Kaisen like an 8 overall. But I think we can agree that these two manga are another example of why these big shonen manga can never seem to stick the landing. It takes a lot of planning ahead of time that writers often underestimate and leave till the very end, and fans that have followed the series for over 5 years have big expectations that often go unanswered. It's for these reasons that even though there's plenty of good ones, a lot of great shonen manga have terrible endings. But now I'd like to hear what you think. How would you rate Jujutsu Kaisen's ending? How would you rate My Hero Academia's ending? How do they compare to other manga? Share your thoughts and see what everyone else has to say down in the comments. I'll pick my favorite and share it as comment of the week on my community tab. And if you'd like another discussion like this one, then check out my video on Jujutsu Kaisen's art style. In that video, I analyzed the artistic evolution of Jujutsu Kaisen. You can find that video in the playlist linked right here. Until then, thank you for watching, and I hope to hear from you soon.